So our last speaker is Jim Resnick, an automotive journalist. He's reported and critiqued new cars, and he has also been sought after by BBC and many other news outlets because he's such a good journalist. But it says in his bio that he has a unique insight into marketing and communications within Mercedes-Benz, Ferrari, and Jaguar and Land Rover. And I'm wondering if that's because you own all of those cars or not. But anyway, he has the inside scoop on the hottest news on the diesel scandal from VW and elsewhere. And he's going to be bringing us up to date on that and other issues. Jim?
So the cognizance of insight into Ferrari, Mercedes, and Jaguar Land Rover, because I worked there. I worked at the headquarters for those three car companies. Jaguar Land Rover is part of one group. And I did that for about 14 years. But really, what I'm here to talk about is what I see as a big opportunity. And I'm not smart enough to know how to get there, but I know that harmonizing auto emissions from across the globe will help greatly in achieving the goals that we all want, which are clean air. And I'll just start off with this. I'm an automotive journalist. Why am I here? Why is this guy here? I test cars. I test Porsches and Corvettes and fly around to racetracks and drive them at 10 tenths, do big smoky burnouts for photographs and all that sort of stuff. And I write mostly for an audience that has Andretti dreams and gas in their veins. So I'm from the other side of the tracks, really. But I also like to breathe. I like to breathe clean air. I like to drink water. And so do my kids. And I know the auto industry from the inside out. The fact that I was an insider gives me a real prescience on what goes on inside companies today and inside Volkswagen, which I'll talk about fairly extensively. So I was at three car companies dealing with good news and bad news. Good reviews from media, but also recalls, legislation that hit companies hard, and highly visible failures of both cars and drivers while in the hands of certain people, politicians, celebrities, a variety of visible people. So even though I'm a technically minded person, and I often deal in stats and figures, telling stories and convincing people through words and illustration and demonstration is far more powerful for me than numbers. And you've gotten a lot of numbers throughout the day, so I'll keep the numbers to a minimum. So I'll share with you my overall observation on auto emissions, harmonizing these regulations, as I say, not just across states, but globally, especially now, meaning post-diesel scandal. This will foster greater innovation and more competitiveness in to the aim of cleaner engines and simplifying the path toward the overall goal of improving air quality. Experiments like the recent carless day in central Paris, which visibly cleared up the air on a very beautiful Sunday, prove that we still have a long way to go on air quality. To me, that puts a far more human dimension on this issue than numbers and statistics. As with acid rain of the late 70s and early 80s, pollution isn't bound by borders. It flies across borders from state to state, from county to county, and across international borders too. Despite this fact, we haven't brought these regulations, chiefly in the form of CO2, hydrocarbons, and NOx, and particulates, in sync with other major economic powers across the globe. Even this year, Europe's allowable levels of NOx for light-duty passenger cars was still over 7 times greater than the US federal limits. More about NOx later as it relates directly to the Volkswagen scandal. So as we're seeing right now, all is not healthy in the automotive emissions world. The VW scandal in which the company admitted to installing emissions control defeating software in 11 million vehicles, is really the biggest auto industry story in about 15 years. And it plays right into your sandbox of air quality. It's bigger even than the bailout of GM and Chrysler. It's bigger than the recent Takata airbag recall fiasco. It's bigger than the Audi sudden acceleration kerfuffle in the 1980s, which almost buried that brand. Why? Why is it that important? Why have I written 5 stories on this myself? Because at the very heart of it, it involves intentional outright deception. Deception by top management, by engineers, and aimed at customers, dealers, governments, and even at its own partner business units around the world. And it's not over yet, not by a long shot. In addition, European manufacturers have stated in the wake of the VW scandal that if governments within the EU begin spot checking or periodic real-world on-the-road testing of auto emissions, they will ask for leniency on the results, meaning that they're not confident in their technology of emissions for diesels. I'm just talking about diesels now. They're not confident that they're going to pass these tests, which doesn't mean that they were nefarious in their engineering of these vehicles, but they know that the scrutiny is laser focused. I would argue that this is front and center here for us today for this summit, because there's significant proof that if the industry had greater harmony of these specifications across the industry, that the VW scandal would probably have been averted. If I put it another way, the discrepancy between emission standards in different markets helped realize this scandal. So just a quick history of the automotive emissions landscape. And I love this photograph. By the way, this is an MGA. As many of you probably know, the movement began in the US with California leading the way. And California continues to lead the way because of its perfect mix of disadvantages, including a very high concentration of passenger cars in everyday use, where long commutes rule. And beginning in a big way during World War II, stationary emitters existed from industry. Also, the LA basin is exactly that. It's a basin that creates the perfect bowl where elements of smog cannot escape. Mountains on 2 sides to the north and east, with prevailing onshore weather trapping that mixture in the air from the west and the south. In fact, a Native American tribe referred to the area before even Spanish settlement as the Valley of Smoke. So pollution in LA has existed for a very long time. From an air quality standpoint, the LA basin is a highly compromised environment for good air quality. Real improvement in air quality finally came in the 1980s, which is a long time. The first real smog attack was 1943, and it's been fairly well documented. So in the 1980s, more stringent new car emission limits began to be phased in. And also there were periodic checks. Every year, your car had to be smog checked. The air quality didn't really improve until then. Anyone who lived in Southern California during this time can tell you that smog-wise, the 1980s came in like a lion and went out like a lamb. So the US, led by California, was so stringent compared to Europe on auto emissions that many European manufacturers either ceased or never bothered to import certain cars to the US because they knew they'd never get them to pass US emissions, and certainly not at a cost absorbable by the marketplace in the sale price of the car. This actually led to a small cottage industry in the 80s of gray market European cars coming into the US. And a couple of different companies did a lot of that work. Back east, it was Amerispec, and on the West Coast, there was another one. I can't remember the name of it. But they did a booming business on converting European market cars to be legal in the US, and people spent a lot of money doing that work. Then in the 1990s, several states, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont initially, adopted California emission standards. And today, this also includes Connecticut, Washington, Rhode Island, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. A total of 12 states now have specifically adopted California emissions for their higher stringency, if that's even a word. This is highly significant to my premise here, because the net result after all this adoption of California stats is that virtually all car manufacturers now who sell in the US build to that spec, the California spec, rather than a maze of several different specs to comply with a laundry list of possible regulations. Meanwhile, in Europe, regulations limiting vehicle emissions went largely unaddressed until 1993 with the old Euro 1 standards. Indeed, as late as 1992, many manufacturers offered cars in the European market to customers with an option, with a catalytic converter or without a catalytic converter. It was left up to the consumer, which would never have flown in the US, not even in the 90s. Before electronic controls that metered fuel much more precisely and more sophisticated emissions control equipment became uniform, auto companies proved very resistant in their role in improving air quality. But once we all got over this hump, the auto business conditions and the air improved and made visible efforts in very low and zero emissions vehicles. GM even produced their quote-unquote Sun Racer, R-A-Y-C-E-R, Racer, concept and research vehicle in 1987. It's this teardrop-shaped, solar-powered vehicle at the top. It set a whole bunch of world records and got a lot of notoriety at the time and was very advanced. They also then produced the EV1, which some of you may remember. It was a lease-only electric vehicle, and it was way ahead of its time when it debuted in 1996. Had a driving range on one charge of 80 to 90 miles on the highway and 60 to 70 in the city. But a lukewarm reception by the buying public, some mysterious service issues, and Toyota's Prius caused GM to cancel the program. They also rounded up each example and destroyed them, as depicted in the documentary Who Killed the Electric Car. With the EV1, it made clear that even a once resistant industry could produce a zero emissions vehicle for the public. If you forget momentarily that each EV1 probably cost $100,000 to produce and engineer, and there's no way to solidly quantify what emissions were produced in the manufacturing of the vehicle, let alone what the environmental impact was of the battery packs after their service life. So the chasm between legislators and auto manufacturers has recently started to close up, with current VW news notwithstanding. This is an interesting fact that kind of blows my mind. Passenger cars that met fuel economy, emissions, and safety strictures without penalty, offering interior volume and a pleasant driving and riding experience by the buyer public, were not always simpatico. This is a new Mercedes C-Class at the top. This paragon of automotive virtue at the bottom is a 1975 Chevy Malibu. Effectively, they weigh the same, yet the Malibu is 2 feet longer. So yes, time marches on, technology marches on, but these two cars weigh exactly the same. So think about it. We as a society have for many years been encouraging people to squeeze into smaller cars, yet we're Americans with all the height and weight that distinction entails. People need space for their families and for how they use their cars. Meanwhile, we want safety systems that take up valuable space and add cost. It's no wonder that the average medium-sized passenger car of today weighs about the same, 3,500 to 4,000 pounds, as the average car of 1975, yet it's over 2 feet shorter. Modern cars are far more densely packed with equipment and technology. So from a manufacturer's standpoint, they're squeezed on multiple sides. With very aggressive CAFE standards that are coming, which it's not at all clear how they're going to meet them with our weight and size norms right now. On another side, with the forces of market affordability which Steve actually talked a little bit about. On another side, with leveraging technology that will enable meeting fuel economy and other needs, ever-tightening emissions regulations. And then lastly, but really most importantly, what customers will buy. Because it's all for naught if new vehicles are not bought. And I didn't mean to rhyme there. So, all the most noble intentions of environmentalists, regulators, and those who want older and dirtier vehicles to cycle out of the fleet won't make a bit of difference in real-world air quality if new cars don't replace old ones and the fleet doesn't turn. Also, just interjecting here, there have been a lot of studies that people hold on to cars a whole lot longer now than even 10, 15, 20 years ago. 8, 10-year-old cars being used every day with well north of 100,000 miles is the norm now. So to cycle the fleet of 1990 or 1980 would take X amount of time. To cycle the fleet now in 2015 takes X plus. It'll take a lot longer to cycle the dirtier fleet, actually the dirtier fleet out of service. In addition, and this is a market-driven, pragmatic approach, if new cars don't sell, the manufacturers don't live, and nor do their suppliers or vendors. And we're still talking about an industry, the auto industry, that constitutes 7.25 million jobs, private sector jobs in the US, just in the US. Until very recently, emissions performance was not something readily quantifiable in consumer sentiment by or value by an automaker. Toyota's Prius changed that. As global warming and climate change have grown inescapable in the public consciousness and therefore top of mind when consumers make purchase decisions, it's become top of mind for manufacturers too, and a potential differentiator for consumers. Many economists and marketers believe there's no force in a market like consumer demand. So as consumers seek cleaner running automobiles, especially at the affordable and therefore high volume end of the market, manufacturers will begin to cater those desires in a far more rapid and holistic way. So much so that VW and Audi launched their clean diesel marketing effort across brands, while Toyota and others in the US market hitched their wagons to hybrid and electric models. Audi even won 8 24 hours of Le Mans endurance races in France using a prototype racing car using a diesel engine. It's a diesel-powered. This is actually the first diesel-powered car to win Le Mans. So they were the first manufacturer to win Le Mans, win a big, huge race, globally recognized, with a diesel engine, and they hitched their wagon to this clean diesel notion. And why did they do that? This wasn't only for marketing purposes. This was because they had a competitive advantage in the race. More time on track means a further distance, and with an endurance race like Le Mans, it's how far you go in 24 hours. Fewer pit stops. Fewer seconds, literally, off the track at speed. That afforded them these 8 wins. Currently, they're using a diesel hybrid, actually, for the World Endurance Championship. So there's a bright spot in the clouds hanging over the industry right now with the VW news. Several boutique automobiles showcase what the industry is capable of. Cars like the Chevy Bolt, BMW's i3, and BMW's i8, the latter of which is a stunning design statement as well as an engineering tour de force. And Tesla's made inroads as well, but I have to question Tesla on a fundamental level. Their latest model, the Model X, which was just debuted 2 weeks ago, is a 5,441-pound SUV with the equivalent of 700 horsepower, and it's $130,000. This is a company that is largely government funded, and the mandate was really high-volume cars that are affordable at a much lower price than $130,000 for the masses. So they're really not fulfilling their mandate in my mind. So I'll skip ahead a bit because I know we're short on time. On the VW scandal, in my last opinion piece, which I titled "Requiring the Impossible: How Pride Brought VW to Its Knees," I wrote that pride in its own engineering capability contributed mightily to the cheating result they now must deal with. In VW top management's collective mindset, to achieve compliance in 2009 with a diesel in California, which is the most restrictive NOx market in the world, without exhaust aftertreatment, would shock and awe the wider automotive engineering community and cause competitors to gape and ask, how did they do that? Well, we now know they didn't do that. And just today, this morning, as I was eating my breakfast, I read that VW announced it will annually carve out 1 billion euros out of its annual budget to set aside for specific development and accelerate production of pure electric vehicles. This is on top of an annual budget of 85.6 billion euro overall. So, main point is that bringing emissions specifications more in line globally and closer to our own US standards, which are the most stringent in the world, will benefit all of us as consumers, as legislators, and also will go a long way to eroding the possibility of disasters like VW's recent cheating scandal. So now the real achievement for VW will be, how do they engineer a fix for their prior engineering shortcomings? Time has always been nature's engineer, but VW has very little time right now. Thank you.